Welcome to Four Quarter Lives, a podcast exploring the profound impact of longer lives and careers on everything: countries, companies, couples, and careers. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and on this week's Four Quarter Lives, I talk with Richard Smith. Richard is one of those rare people who can make a subject as technical as pensions feel not just understandable, but deeply human. A lifelong pensions professional in the UK, he spent much of his career focused on one deceptively simple question. Why is it still so hard for people to see in one place what they've actually saved for later life? Richard has become one of the clearest independent voices behind the push for UK pension dashboards, the systems designed to help people find and understand the multiple pension pots they accumulate across modern careers. What makes this conversation so relevant to Four Quarter Lives is that pensions aren't really about finance alone. They're about visibility, agency, trust, and the emotional reality of longer lives. If we're going to live longer, work in more fragmented ways, and navigate quarter 3 and 4 with greater uncertainty, then we need better tools and better language to help us prepare. In this conversation, we explore why pension systems were designed for a different era, why Gen X may be heading for a retirement shock, why women especially want clearer answers, and why the real question behind all this is the most human one of all. Am I going to be okay when I'm older? Richard Smith, welcome to Four Quarter Lives. Delighted to have you.
Hi, Avivah. Humbled to be with you and humbled to be amongst your very distinguished previous guests.
Perhaps that's a good place to start. Let's tell our readers why you totally belong here. We're going to have a somewhat nerdy conversation about pensions, which I don't want to turn them off because you make this thing way more fascinating than most people I know. Give us a little bit about your own background so we know who's authoritatively going to guide us through this topic.
Thanks. So, I'm in the United Kingdom, in the UK. So a career pensions professional, started out in pensions admin, done various things. But since about the turn of the millennium, there's been a sort of a feeling that we need to connect up consumers' different pensions and let them see what they've got really easily. And then with the advent of the smartphone, more and more countries have brought forward facilities to do this. So I've become, towards this final stage of my career, very narrow and quite deep on this one topic, which we generally refer to as pensions dashboards, although other countries talk about them as pension tracking systems, PTSs, but in the UK we call them pensions dashboards. So I was lucky enough to help the UK government with defining the data standards for the data that flows through the technology ecosystem. And now I've done various roles on the program since then, but now I'm sort of full-time pro bono and independent, being a sort of consumer advocacy voice for this, because it's really going to be quite big change for retirement provision in the UK.
So inadvertently, you're also a very archetypal Q3 model for having impact in these decades of our lives.
I feel so privileged that this topic has come about in my career, because I think it's a fascinating thing. We'll come on to why I think it's fascinating aspect. But also to be personally at the age where I can
actually spend some time on it. Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. So let's start with the big picture. Most people have a vague sense that pensions are complicated, but they don't really understand why. It's full of actuaries and highly specialized folk. I used to work with some of those kinds of people. How did we end up with a system where people accumulate 3 or 4 pensions over a lifetime and just simply don't know what they have?
Well, I guess I should start by saying I'm not a researcher and I'm not a policy official. I'm just a humble pension administrator from Reading in Berkshire in the UK. But I got interested in connecting up the data. And what I've discovered is that through that process and thinking about what the visibility of that data means, it sort of opens the door to thinking about everything. And I think where I would summarize this is it comes down to who do we think should be in charge of supporting us in this latter part of life. Let's call it sum of quarter 3 and quarter 4.
Yeah.
And when I mean sort of in charge of supporting us, I guess quarter 1, let's broadly call that education. I think most of us accept that's if we're lucky enough to have extant parents, that's our parents catering for our basic needs, our housing and our food and our welfare. Second quarter, I think most people accept, that's up to us to find some work in the economy or the private sector. Maybe if we're entrepreneurs, we may set up our own business, and there may be some mix of that. But then sometime in quarter 3, over the last 120 years or so, we've created this thing called retirement, this concept of a period of life where you are looked after, you've got some income to sustain you and meet your needs during that phase of life. Now, not every country has come to the same settlement on this. So some countries say, well, clearly that should be the state. And of course, by the state, I mean society, through tax revenues. Yeah. So if you look at countries like Portugal or Austria or Italy, they have a very high level of state pension provision in terms of replacement rate. And what I mean by that is the average earnings across society is a high level of replacement of that earnings level in retirement. So really up in the high 80s, 90s.
So if you were earning 100 before, in retirement, your pension should replace 70 or 80% of it.
Something like that. It varies a lot by country. It's very tricky to do sort of simple analyses across all the countries. But yes, that's exactly right. UK, we took a rather different stance on this. We said, well, no, state should cover a base load. So we have a basic state pension, largely deriving from sort of William Beveridge post-Second World War, a base level of old age pension in the UK now. It's about £12,000 a year sterling, so about £1,000 a month before tax. You couldn't really live on that. Would keep you out of poverty but you wouldn't really be very happy. So we've got a base load, but then anything on top, we've said, no, that's going to be what's called Pillar 2 or occupational or workplace provision. And we've put in place legislation that says if you're an employer, you have to put people into retirement saving. But of course, every employer is doing that. So if I have 3 or 4 different employments over my career, I'm going to end up with 3 or 4 different pension entitlements or pension pots, you might call them, that in aggregate make up that total provision.
And they're totally separate, run by different people, different funds, they're not related in any way.
Absolutely. Now, again, other countries have done another stance on this. So Australia, and I think also in Mexico and other countries as well, there's a sense that, well, look, we've now got a modern labour force where people move to job to job to job, and it's increasing, isn't it? So my Gen Z children have had more jobs in their 20s than I've had in my 50s, already. So wouldn't it be more sense if there was one account, that stayed with you? So when you start a job, so you say to your employer, here's my bank account for my salary and here's my pension account for my pension, and that stays with you. So that may be a model that we get to in the UK eventually, but I just would caveat that with the role of the employer is important. So, big employers put a lot of value in that they have set up good pension provision, with pension provider X, if that makes sense.
Yep.
But it does mean if you work for 3 prestigious employers, you'll have a good pension with X and a good pension with Y and a good pension with Z. So yes, it's a challenge.
And so you never know really what the cumulative amounts will be. You wouldn't know just like how much have I got.
So this is the problem. So up to 80%. I saw a recent research from a provider called Money Farm in the UK. They surveyed 2,000 people. 79% of people don't know what they've got in aggregate. I feel professionally, personally embarrassed that the industry has let this happen. We've left millions of UK working age adults behind.
Yep. So with no predictability of what their future, so they don't know if they have to gear up or if they start slowing down.
Well, that's 79% who do, but 20-ish% do. And I was advising a fintech.
I assume the 20% are the better off amongst them.
Absolutely.
Who can pay for a financial advisor who tells them what they've got.
I was advising a fintech provider called Money Hub. Everything begins with money, doesn't it? So Money Hub. And we did a lot of research on dashboards, and we very clearly saw this persona, which we christened Bob. Bob, because he's generally male, generally older, generally white, generally quite affluent, generally quite annoying, and not, I can say this because I am Bob, not hugely known for his empathy towards everybody else. Just give them more information and they'll read it and understand, won't they? So yes, you can, if you do take the trouble to look at annual statements statements that your providers send you, and you notify them of your change of address when you move house across 40 years, and you do understand what it means, and you've got a spreadsheet, by the way, Bob has got a spreadsheet at home, he loves all this stuff, then yes, you can take control of it. But that's hard to do. It's a lot of load, a lot of mental load, and turns out most people don't.
And we know how much most people love to manage their money. So when you began working on this UK pensions dashboard, you discovered there are roughly 120 million pensions in the UK across about 3,000 schemes. So what does that complexity tell us about the labor market and how outdated our pension designs might be? I mean, it sounds like there are only a couple of countries that have solved this. Isn't that interesting?
Well, a number have. So I did an independent research tour of Belgium, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. Other countries have as well. And the European Union has done research reports to help its other member states look at this as well, because this isn't basically every developed economy has this issue. But really simple maths in the UK, there's about 40 million working age adults.
Yep.
About 52 million adults.
Yep.
The rest are below working age at school, and about 40 million are sort of working age. They've got about 3 to 4 pensions each on average.
Yep.
But of course, that varies enormously. So a career teacher could be teaching for 40 years and would have one pension in the governmental teachers pension scheme, TPS, plus their state pension. Compared with someone like me who's been in the private sector, I've got 9 pensions. So, of course, it varies enormously. So, yes, that's how we get to sort of over 100 million different separate pension entitlements held by many, many hundreds or thousands of schemes, because many employers over the decades have set up a scheme for their workers. They've done a good thing. You know, post-war, many employers and then small employers set up, we want a scheme. We want to look after our workers today, and we want to look after them when they stop working in the future. Because, of course, they did retire from that employer because the whole system was designed for my dad, who had one 40-year employment with one defined benefit pension building up. And it's exactly what he did in post office telecoms. It became the BT, British Telecom pension scheme. And then he had 36 years of final salary pension coming out of it, inflation proofed, before he died in his mid-90s. So it was designed for my dad, and it still is. So meanwhile, over the previous 50 years, we moved to a modern labour market where people churn and they get all these different entitlements. If we still had the world of my dad, I guess we'd have 40 million adults with one pension each.
Right.
Does that make sense? Yep.
So what did you find when you traveled around all these nice Nordic countries that I always love to love because they do so many things, right? What have they done on pensions that's different?
Well, I think a core thing I would say is consumer awareness. There are different motivations for every country. And this is a real important caveat to put in, is that each country is coming to this with their own particular pension system and also pension deliveries in terms of state versus private sector. But also culture. Do you know there are big differences? So it's.
Hey, I spent 30 years in France. I can go online and it gives me a number. It does. It sorts it all out, even though the system's super complex and pay as you go and maybe broke. At least they give me a number.
Fantastic. So every country's got its sort of different route to get here. But I think a common theme that I saw was consumers really value and desire awareness. Almost what you just said, Avivah. You know, I can see a number, and that came out very clearly. Most consumers only want one number, which is the monthly income I might get when I stop work, and preferably net of income tax, because you can relate that to what you get today.
Yeah, absolutely. And that number is actually hard to find. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so I want to switch to sort of looking at what happens when longevity meets financial reality, because we're also being told all these pension systems are broke. So, and my work tends to focus on helping people understand that they're going to live a lot longer than they expect. From your perspective, what's the biggest misunderstanding people have about how long their retirement is going to be?
So I wouldn't be discourteous enough to guess your age, Avivah, but I think that's probably fair to say we're both in quarter 3.
We are, and I'm kind of towards the end of it now.
No, I can't believe that. You know, and your body starts to misbehave, doesn't it? You know, and I think, you know, I've got arthritis in my finger. It's starting to bend and everything. And all sorts of some other things I wouldn't want to mention start going wrong. And I think as humans, we just don't really want to think about living for a while with ever increasing number of things not being quite right. So I think
it's not the most inspiring prognosis, is it?
So I think this is the point. So when we think about a long life, we also sort of overlay with that, well, what state of health am I going to be in? I just did read, just before coming on, I saw a statistic. I don't have the detail, I'm afraid. I think it's from the Office of National Statistics, ONS, about level of healthy life expectancy. Yep. So there's life expectancy, then there's healthy, and it's falling in the UK. You know, it's sort of around 60, 61 that you can expect to have on average to have general good health. So really, I think, you know, where I'm encouraged by, you know, so much of the online material is we all need to focus on the core elements of, you know, diet and exercise and sleep, and also sort of what you might say attitude, I suppose, you know, how your mindset, your well-being, because that what you really want to do is to have the longer life, but have a healthier, longer life for as long as possible. So I think
a lot of people fear these longer lives also in financial terms, that they just won't have enough money for this extended retirement period that many people are looking forward to.
And I think this is where we all have to take a bet on life, and we're all going to lose. You know, they say the casino, the house always wins. I think maybe like God always wins. So the thing is, I get to retirement, I've saved up a pot of money. Well, I think I'm going to live a long time, so I'm going to purchase this thing called an annuity that gives me a guaranteed income for as long as I live. Like my dad to my mid-90s, could be 30, even, who knows, 40 years. But then I die after 7 years. You know, and then all that money has gone to the insurance company, you know. But on the other hand, I might say, no, I don't think I'm going to live very long. I'm not in that great health. You know, I'm going to splurge the money now. But then I end up living for 20, 30 years and I run out of money. So we all have to take a bet. Yep. And it's a scary thing we have to do, and we're not going to win. But I think there are ways to hedge your bet, if I can put it that way. And I think where I get to on this, and this is where I'm quite excited, is we bring together both retirement saving or pension data together with spending data. Yeah. So we have quite a highly developed sort of open banking infrastructure in the UK. So it's so good where you can connect your current accounts, and the AI categorization of what you're actually spending your money on is phenomenal.
Yeah, it's gotten really good the last year or two. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the way to hedge your bets is to distinguish between essential versus discretionary spend. You know, what do I need to be able to be supported? You know, this key thing I started with, to be supported to meet my core food bills, my energy. In the UK, we have local taxation is council tax. That's a big proportion of a lot of retired people's outgoings in the UK. What do I need? And inflation proof that as well. So if I do live for 30 years, so lock that in, but then leave some flexibility with anything else I've got maybe on top, if that makes sense. So I think that is the way to think about this big question that none of us can answer, which is how long we're going to live or when we're going to die.
And I want to dig into some of this number stuff, because one of the fascinating ideas we debated is the shift from talking about pension pots to pension income. And I think that's, we get confused between a lot of these things. So why is showing people that they're going to have £2,000 per month for life much, much more powerful than telling them they have £200,000 saved in a bank?
Because that's something they can relate to. If you show people the pot, the big number, I call this the small number, big number debate.
Small number, big number debate. I like that. Okay.
If you show them the big number, they're going to think they're rich. A lot of people will never have had that amount.
Kind of money. Yep.
And even if they've had that asset in house, you can't buy a sausage with a brick. You know, it's not liquid, is it? Your property asset, but you can see that you've got this amount of money.
Yeah, hundreds of thousands of pounds. You think you're fine.
For sure. What's quite interesting, what I saw on the Swedish dashboard is right on the homepage, they sort of show your retirement stretching out into the future as a graphic through to your 80s or even to your 90s. But they also show average life expectancy for someone of your age and gender to show you, look, you could well likely live that long. So, you know, if you keep the maths really simple, and let's just ignore inflation and investment returns for a minute, then we add that complexity when we get over the basics. But if we just ignore that for a minute, 2,000 a month is 24 a year. If I think I'm going to live for 10 years, that's 240,000. If I'm going to think I'm going to live for 20 years, that's 500,000.
Yeah.
It's really very, very simple. And I think what we in the pensions industry, who, by the way, are largely Bob, in fact, we're almost exclusively Bob, we love to flood...
I know there's not a Karen among them.
We love to flood the debate immediately with complexities around inflation and investment return and all sorts of challenges like that. You can get there with consumers, but you have to start with really, really simple. And I think I've witnessed in testing of dashboards that people do want to learn. And I call it snippetization, if you snippetize the info, do you know what I mean? So really digestible nuggets of info, like explaining what a defined contribution pension is. Well, it's a pot of money that you can use to stretch over. Oh, right, that's what that is. And so what's a defined benefit? Oh, that's what that is. And people
there aren't any more defined. We don't even have to educate people to define.
Well, you say that, Avivah. So what's happening actually with the Gen X's in the UK?
Yeah.
I'm nudging 60. All my 60-year-old peers, we have got what's called deferred defined benefit that we built up in our first and second jobs in the 1980s and 90s. So actually in the UK, the Gen X's come into retirement over the next 20 years are going to have I've heard Beck Wilson call it a lasagna of incomes. We're going to have state income, some defined benefit a little bit from the 80s and 90s, and then some defined contribution converted to...
Okay, interesting. Yep.
Yeah. But the Gen Zs are going to have largely wholly DC, if that makes sense.
Right. Okay. So I like the lasagna metaphor. That'll stick with me for a while. Layers and layers. That's the complexity. So let's talk about another challenge of this whole pension thing that happens to us all at some point. We often talk about the accumulation phase of pensions. We've just been talking, do people have enough? Have they saved enough? But often the next challenge is decumulation. My husband finds this one very difficult, I must say. How to spend money when you're not certain of life expectancy and everybody's telling you we're all going to live so long. So why is that part of the system so poorly understood? And is there also a dashboard to help you decumulate?
So I think it's the other side of the question we were having. It's that it's not knowing this bet, this gamble you've got to take with life about how long it's going to be. And I think there's something else here, because I think it's particularly the wealthy who have accumulated. Their life of accumulation has been about beating the market, about winning, and grow. Oh, look at my performance, my investment returns, So then the fact that they cannot beat God, well, whoever's in charge, I don't know.
They're trying, Richard. They're trying.
So I think part of the thing to do is to take the emotion out of it, to know, well, at least I'm covered for my core needs. That's what I'm saying, discretionary spend. And then you can take some joy in the non-discretionary. So, the gifts to the grandchildren, or the family holidays, or the Ruby wedding anniversary, or whatever it is. My daughter
so your pension dashboard would basically tell, in the same way that it says how much you have to save and how much you have, it'll give you a notion of how much you can spend every month.
Right. So some do overseas, but in UK, initially, version 1 dashboard is an accumulation tool, because the first problem right now is people in working life don't know what they've got. Yep. But then we do actually move into how to spend it, if that makes sense. We have something else coming in the UK, which is really quite important. And it links back to your previous question about a pot versus income. So up until 2015 in the UK, you had to use a defined contribution pot to purchase an annuity. So you had to give that lump of money, that 200,000, to an insurance company who would then pay you an income until you died, however long that was. The Conservative government in 2014, 2015 said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. And they called it pension freedom, to spend that pot how you wanted to. Turns out most people couldn't cope with that freedom. So now, with a Labour government in power again in the UK, we're having something in its legislation that's coming in Parliament right now called guided retirement, saying providers are going to have to offer you a default income. So if you do nothing, we will give you this default income, because this worry about not spending was exacerbated by the fact that you had all this freedom on how to spend it. Does that make sense? Most people, in my experience, want to be told what to do but they want to see on an app what's happening to them. They don't really want to have to take decisions, but they do want to know what's happening.
It's fascinating. Yeah, because, well, listen, the security and the calculations and the pension and the actuarial predictions are impossible for most people to navigate. And you've said that even really wealthy savers struggle with decumulation. Why are people so afraid to spend their retirement savings even when they have more than enough?
Well, I think there's a worry about end-of-life costs. And there's also, I don't know about your children, but I worry as a parent, my Gen Z's children, it's really hard to be a Gen Z, so I want there to be something for them. Do you know what I mean? And if I did happen to die earlier than maybe expected, then let's hope some of that can be available for them. So I think there's two things. There's what's the cost going to be of my end of life? Will I have long-term care costs? Only about 1 in 6 or less than that do in the UK. So on average, you won't be having long-term care costs. But also, if there is something left and I don't extinguish all that retirement saving by living to a century, living my 4 quarters, then can there at least it be something, if possible, to pass to the Zeds who are really, really struggling?
Is there any kind of standard formula or percentage of your whatever lump sum that you can? Are you supposed to decumulate 3% a year of your? So is there something like that?
Various maths has been done there. There's a 4% rule that's dependent on a certain investment portfolio. That's been looked at again, and maybe that could nudge up a little bit. But I think one thing I would say, and sort of any standard or any research that talks about cohorts, I temper a little bit with what I've learned, and this is why we do dashboards. Everyone is individual.
Yeah.
So 2 school leavers starting at a job, maybe in the same grade at the same level of pay, maybe their life course so far is pretty similar. But then what happens? 40 years, 2/4 of life happens to them then. So they may or may not get married. They may or may not buy a house. They may or may get promoted or change jobs. They may or may not get sick. Any number of things could happen. And I talk about, in the UK, we've got 40 million unique pension stories.
Yep.
Do you know what I mean?
Yep, absolutely. There's so much diversity in this space. So let's talk about these new generations facing retirement. You're talking about Gen X coming up to it. I'm the tail end of boomer myself, so I'm a lot older than you, Richard. You've said you're particularly concerned about Gen X. What worries you about this generation's preparedness? Are they prepared? Are they not at all prepared?
Not that much older. I'm a very old X, so I think you and I span.
And I'm a very young. Okay.
Yeah, we're just either side of the border looking at each other. Yeah. So it's really interesting. This is very topical. There's a think tank in the UK called the Social Market Foundation, SMF, and they've just done a big research piece on this. And there's a research coming out that they've entitled Pension Shock. And that really is the other side of the coin from what I was talking about before, which is dashboards are all about awareness. So maybe I think SMF are finding in their research that maybe half, maybe slightly more, 54% maybe of Gen X's don't know what their retirement income, as a monthly income might be. So if you come to that quite late, the time you've got to do anything about that is limited. And obviously the nearer and nearer to 65, 66, 67 that you find that out, the less and less time you've got to do anything about it. So there's another report from SEI, they're a pension provider in the UK and in US. The group who they found most want to look at what they've got on a pensions dashboard, and I love this, is Gen X women.
Yeah,
go girls.
You don't surprise me there.
So, but I'd ask you a question, Avivah. If they're going to have a shock, maybe, I think it depends on how you measure what an adequate income would be, but maybe, 20, 30, 40% of people are going to have a bit of a shock when they see that total income, that total estimated retirement income on the dashboard. If they're going to have that shock, do you think we should tell people? Do you think people should have facility to find that out?
Oh, bloody hell, yes. But that's my leaning about everything, which is why I'm running podcasts and why I want to moan about gender pension gaps, because women want to know because they know that it won't be enough. And then they have to calculate how much they still have to lean in Q3 into some really prime earning years.
I love the positivity, but I worry about the fear. So I worry that, well-being, mental well-being is maybe on a dip. And then if we worry people further with, oh yes, and your Q3/4 is going to be a bit grim as well. I talk about giving people a pensions hug, so show them what they've got, but then don't criticize them. about, well, you should have saved more in your 20s and your 30s, but give them a hug and then see together collaboratively with government and with employer about what can be done, as you said, to work out what can be done to nudge that up so that when you get to retirement, it's a little bit more livable.
Yes, but I'm not at all surprised that it's the women who want to know because, listen, we've done enough reporting now on these gender pension gaps and how the majority of older people in poverty are women, and that women outlive men still by 4 or 5 years. And so they have a double challenge.
There's another element here, again, like the variance. So what a lot of countries have seen, and in fact, who's moved, Denmark and Netherlands have moved to this on their dashboards. They want to really see pension at household level.
Yes.
So, and in fact, it was so exciting. I was sitting next to Michael Rush, who runs the Danish dashboard in Copenhagen, and he said to me, I'm going to sign into my own pension. So he logged in and showed me his pensions. But he said, I mentioned this to my wife at breakfast. He said, I'm going to send an alert now. And he sent an alert through to the government ID system that alerted her to say, do you give temporary access to this individual to have access to your ID? And she said yes, because he'd mentioned it at breakfast. So he could then log in as her. And then it showed their retirement timeline with both of their pensions. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. But he said, calm down, Richard. We've been going 25 years, right? So what they all said to me is you need to launch a basic dashboard. But very often when I talk about this, people say to me, oh, can you do that at household level? And the answer is, well, yes, in version 2, 3 or 4, but not initially. But the other thing to say on that, if you're a separating couple, you perhaps don't want your soon-to-be ex-spouse to see what you've got necessarily, or, you want to talk to your listeners about that. So I think it's quite binary. You either very much do or very much don't want to work at household level.
Absolutely. Although I also find fascinating that in a system that has been largely designed for where we come from anyways, around families, that we ever had individual pensions. I mean, that was a design flaw, no? Which has punished the women who mostly had to stop and care for kids and do all this stuff, which is basically a funding mechanism for their husbands' pensions that they then don't have access to, especially they don't have access to if they ever split up or he leaves. And it just seems like a inappropriately individualistic system in a country that was leaning family-wards.
I love your podcast, Avivah. It opens your mind to literally everything, doesn't it? It's like, how do we live as society? Is the norm to be in a cohabiting couple that if you're lucky enough, you rear children? And
it used to be. The problem is not anymore. So
I think that thing you just said is why maybe governments have moved towards more individualistic systems. But most of the couples I know who are, hitting 60, friends, absolutely they're operating as a couple. But I think what we really need to see is that happening earlier in life.
Yes, absolutely.
So, for example, if more typically females are taking time out of the workplace in their 30s, maybe to rear families, and it is still typically more female, what can be done there, either by putting more in the 20s or maybe he can put into her pension. Do you know what I mean? While
exactly.
She's not in the workplace.
Why shouldn't there be, if not forever, a family pension, a parental pension for the 10 years of early childhood or something? Well, these are all great ideas. But if someone is listening today in the current system and they're in their 40s or 50s, so maybe a bit earlier enough to do something, suddenly saw their projected retirement income on your dashboard, what's the single most important action you think they should take first?
Well, what comes out is defined by what goes in. That's the main thing. So pension contributions going in. And what I'm talking about more and more is workers wanting to have a low friction click through to their employer's payroll system to say, can I nudge up my contributions by 50 quid a month more or 1% or whatever? And even more than that, a lot of employers in the UK, we have a government scheme called NEST, the National Employment Savings Trust. Nest Insight is their research wing. They did some research in 2022. About half of employers offer employer contribution matching. So if I put in an extra 1%, my employer will put in another 1%. Guess what? Not everybody takes that up. There's a lot of employer contribution matching money left.
Free money, listeners.
You don't have to put in more yourself, and that's the challenge. But if you put in 1% more, your employer will put in 1% more, and that's phenomenal. So if you can possibly afford it, don't leave that employer money on the table. And then, of course, do that as early as possible, because then you'll have the magicking effect of the compounding over time. So get it going.
Tell your kids. So we should all actually also be telling our children that they should be maximizing their
Well, yes, but they also
matching.
want to get property, don't they? So I think this is another come back to the point of, where on earth do you point your assets as a Gen Z? It's really, really challenging. But yes, certainly, I think even 20-somethings should be maximizing employer matching. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to do another podcast on Gen Z strategies for pensions. All right, we're going to conclude on, beneath all you've heard on the policy and technical complexity, to me, it sounds like there's a really simple human question, which is, am I going to be okay when I'm older? After everything you've learned, heard, worked on around pensions, what's giving you hope, Richard, and what concerns you?
I think I'd say the power of the rational yet emotional human and the ability of technology to support both of those. So what I mean by that is, touching on what I mentioned before, I think people do want to know how they're getting on, how things are building up for their later lives, but they don't want to be inundated. I've seen some really fascinating AR avatars who, when the dashboard data comes through, she or he can talk to you in your terms about what you've got. Because I think once you see what you've got, the key word that keeps coming out is trust. I want to talk to someone or something that I trust. It could be an entity, an organization, a government, a mum, a friend, an avatar, whoever I trust to talk to me about that. And this really comes to the emotional side, because if things aren't right in terms of, I'm not building up quite enough, I won't do anything about it unless the emotional engagement is there. So I need to be aware of what I've got. I need to be confident in myself and in the organizations I'm dealing with, but I need to have the trust that if I do something like increase my contributions, it's going to end up with a good outcome. And so I'm really excited. I feel so privileged to be alive at the time that application programming, interface technology, APIs, and smartphones is available to join up these decades worth of data, over 100 million records that have existed on systems for 40 years. I don't think there's probably another area of human life where you have to connect so much data over so many decades. Yeah. So that fills me with real hope that people do want to know, but they want it snippetized, given to them in bite-sized chunks, and we can also win the emotion so that they can feel confident about their futures. I think it's pulling hope for the future. I think you've had previous guests, quarter 3 and 4 is about your thriving, isn't it? The quarter 1 is about growing up and exciting and partying, but you don't really know what's going on. Quarter 2, if you're lucky enough to have children, is just about surviving, isn't it? Quarter 3 and 4, you want to thrive. So you want to know you're going to be okay when you get there. And I think there's a personal angle here that I sometimes share. So I was very lucky to get married in 98, but soon after our third child was born, Heather was diagnosed with cancer. So she had chemotherapy for 10 years, but then she died 12 years ago in 2014. So I experienced at 46 what it is to become a pensioner, because I now get a spouse's pension from Heather. So, that is back in the old day, Avivah. That is where it was a household pension. So it was more typically the man died and she got the spouse's pension. Yeah. So I found out emotionally what it is to get a pension, to receive a monthly pension way too early. But I think, so my story is about sort of trying to pull the hope out of a situation that feels a bit bleak. I've said, we're all going to lose our bet with God, and that God always wins, and it's going to be a pension shock for a lot of Gen X's. Okay, well, let's just recognize that and let's face into it, and let's try and bring some hope out of that through rationality, but also recognizing emotion.
Richard, you sound like somebody I trust. You've been pushing for this pension dashboard in the UK now for many years. Is it on the horizon? When do you hope it'll be in our hot little hands so we can all be shocked?
So it's really exciting. Government mandated the pensions industry to connect all those 100 million pension records, and they are largely now connected. The final ones get connected through this spring and summer through to late summer 26. And then the front end, where you can actually see pensions, is live, but it's in what's called private beta testing. And just last week, the government body that's running this in the UK has gone out and started recruitment of tens of thousands of people to test it in a private beta sense. And then when government ministers are comfortable that that testing is showing that the whole ecosystem is working and consumers are understanding what they're seeing, then there will be a launch, and it's made fully public available. This isn't official, but I might guess that might be sometime in 2027. But it's live right now in private beta testing.
Fantastic. Richard, I want to thank you for all the work you've done, all your role modeling and enthusiasm of the impact that Q3ers can have on getting these kinds of services for Q3 and Q4ers available. And I'm delighted to hear it's coming.
Thanks so much, Avivah. It's been a pleasure.
What I appreciated about this conversation with Richard Smith is that he takes something most people avoid, pensions, and reveals the profoundly human question underneath it. This isn't really just about dashboards or data standards or retirement products. It's about visibility. It's about trust. And it's about how we prepare emotionally and financially for lives that are getting longer, more varied, and a lot less predictable. Richard makes the case that in a world of fragmented careers and layered pension history, clarity matters, not because everybody wants to become a pensions expert, but because people need to know whether they're on track and what they can still do if they're not. I was also struck by his insistence that this should not be about blame or panic, but about what he called a kind of pensions hug. Honest information given humanely with enough support to help people act. And perhaps that's the bigger lesson here. In longer lives, planning matters more, but so does compassion. For our present selves and for the future selves we're all slowly becoming. I'm Avivah Wittenberg-Cox, and we are living our 4-quarter lives. For more thinking about the impact of our 4-quarter lives, you can read my column at Forbes and subscribe to my Elderberries newsletter on Substack. Let's design lives that aren't just longer, but better.